The most frustrating aspect of the corporate media's coverage of the negotiations surrounding the so-called budget reconciliation bill, that's Biden's Build Back Better agenda, is that they treat everyone involved as if they're all, honest actors looking to do what they consider to be the right thing. Now, Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema have notoriously become obstacles to the passage of that bill. And this week, Biden did go out of his way to try to appease Joe Manchin in ways that are incredibly frustrating and honestly predictable. So Biden informed House progressives that the final bill to expand the social safety net is expected to drop tuition-free community college. Moreover, he indicated that the child tax credit, a key Democratic priority, would likely be extended for just one additional year. Remember, he was promising to make it permanent. And that's much shorter than what many in their party wanted. The child tax credit will also be means tested, keeping with what Manchin had wanted. All right. So again, let me just emphasize the fact that the way the budget reconciliation bill was proposed wasn't even radical by any stretch of the imagination. For instance, the child tax credit was supposed to lift about 50% of children living in poverty out of poverty. I would argue that a far better solution would be to do anything and everything in our power to lift all children out of poverty. But for people like Joe Manchin, lifting 50% out of poverty, that's a little too extreme. And so, unfortunately, Biden decided to concede that portion of the legislation, along with other things. Biden also indicated to the group of progressives that they would reduce the proposed funding for so-called home care for the elderly and disabled, because, we're just spending too much money on that group, down to less than $250 billion. Democrats had wanted to keep the funding at $400 billion. The president told progressive lawmakers that negotiators are also weighing reducing the duration of paid leave benefits outlined in the package to just 4 weeks, down from the proposed 12 weeks. So honestly, the most important and also popular provisions in the Build Back Better agenda are now being either completely scrapped or they're being cut down in regard to funding. And the news was a tremendous blow to progressives or anyone who actually understands the undeniable necessity for a more robust version of this legislation. But we need to actually go further than refusing to take Manchin or Sinema's reasons for opposing the bill at face value. They're not honest actors, but they are rational actors because what they're doing serves their own self-interest. And really what I'm asking for is taking a step back and looking at this system, right? The system of incentives and disincentives, and how by understanding that system, you can predict that negotiations for this type of legislation are going to play out the way that they have played out. So let's talk about what I'm specifically referring to. Now, while legalized bribery through the process of campaign donations is certainly a problem, another massive issue is how lawmakers are personally invested in businesses that want to maximize their profits by keeping taxes low. And I'm sure most of you who have been following this story have noticed that both Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kyrsten Sinema have pushed back against the notion of increasing corporate taxes. And sure enough, this week, Joe Biden made it clear that it's very unlikely that the budget reconciliation bill would have the pay for in the form of higher corporate taxes. And there's another issue that's worth mentioning. And I've mentioned it on this show before. I mention it on a regular basis because I do find it to be incredibly important. And it's part of that system that essentially incentivizes these elected officials to work against the best interests of their own constituents. And what I'm talking about here is the stock portfolios that these members of Congress have. They are personally invested in individual stocks for corporations that want to maximize their profits and want to provide a return on investment to their shareholders, some of whom are members of Congress, right? And the way you maximize profits is you screw over your workers, exploit labor, and extract as much labor for the cheapest possible price, keep taxes incredibly low so you can pay dividends to shareholders. And when you look at the stock portfolios of various members of Congress, including Democrats like Nancy Pelosi in the House, for instance, you'll notice that they're doing real well. In fact, they're doing so well that they're beating the market. And at the same time, you have various individuals who are keeping track of this market activity and the financial disclosures that members of Congress are putting out, and just essentially copycatting. Like they decide to copycat what members of Congress are doing because they realize, well, these people have legislative abilities. They get to govern and make decisions about these companies that impact the profits that these companies can make. And so why don't we just follow what they're doing and make some money? In fact, there are TikTokers doing that and bragging about it on the social media platform. Let's watch.
Shouts out to Nancy Pelosi, the stock market's biggest whale. Apparently she's decided to go very heavy in tech stocks, so I'm going to show you guys which ones she bought. According to her financial disclosure form, she bought Google, Amazon, Apple, and Nvidia. This can be considered very good for all of these stocks, and she's invested over $11 million in all of these positions put together. Shouts out to Nancy Pelosi for the stock tips.
Okay, so CEO Watch List on TikTok gave a shout out to Pelosi, but he doesn't really understand in that video how there's actual insider trading happening with members of Congress because of the fact that they have access to undisclosed information through the form of these classified briefings. And by the way, Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. She gets to decide what type of legislation gets brought to the floor for a vote. So she's not going to work against her own personal investments, right? But, you know, that particular TikToker seemed to be a little oblivious about that. But I also noticed that there are other TikTokers who are doing similar things like Iris app. Let's watch this video and see what the, advice is.
And would you look at that? Literally clockwork. The US government has an agreement to purchase a supercomputer from who else? NVIDIA. Yup, NVIDIA. The one that Nancy bought back on 7/23/21. In that tweet, the news comes out literally yesterday, like 8/24/21. She knew. And you would have known if you followed her portfolio on Iris. Come do it. I have a group chat going where we're kind of going over how to use the app and whatnot. Comment below if you want to be added to the group chat and I'll let you in.
So that's a TikToker named Chris Josephs. And, he is doing what I think makes a lot of sense if you're just looking to invest in the stock market and make money. He's just following the stock activity or the behavior that he's noticing from some significant members of Congress like Nancy Pelosi. In fact, NPR reported that in the past year and a half, Josephs has been taking advantage of a law called the Stock Act. More on that in just a minute, which requires lawmakers to disclose stock trades and those of their spouses within 45 days. He is personally investing when he sees which stocks are picked. Now, he also says this, I'm at a point where if you can't beat them, join them. I typically do buy the next one she does. I'm going to buy. We don't want this to be a left versus right thing. We don't really care. We just want to make money. Now, here at Jacobin, that is not what the priority is, right? The whole point of this show is to talk about systems of power, how we can create a better society. So if you're just looking for a way to maximize your own profits, this isn't the show for you. However, I do think that this story is a telling one. If you wanted to evaluate the extent of Congress's conflicts of interest, all you'd have to do is take a look at how much money these members of Congress, members of the House and the Senate, have invested in the market. So far this year, Senate and House members have filed more than 4,000 financial trading disclosures with at least $315 million of stocks and bonds bought or sold. And look, while gridlock is a notorious characteristic of Congress, the fact of the matter is, when it comes to passing legislation that helps to enrich themselves or their own staffers, there seems to be a lot of agreement. I take you to 2013, when Congress actually passed something related to the Stock Act that allowed for them to essentially loosen some of the restrictions for their staffers and their own, stock trading activity. Let's watch.
Everybody's losing faith in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and all the different branches. So, what did they do? They repealed a major part of the Stock Act at the end of last week when no one was paying attention. It was supposed to apply to the 28,000 staffers as well. So the staffers are incredibly important, and whether they have stock information is important. And so now, of course, they exempted them. They repealed it in the Senate in 10 seconds. In the House, it took a whole 14 seconds. They were unanimous. And by the way, here's the final icing on the cake. What was their official excuse for repealing this incredibly important check to make sure that they're not cheating and that they're not getting any extra advantages in Washington? Quote, they claimed it was an unwarranted risk to national security.
You could just cite national security for doing anything if you're a member of Congress, right? Our staffers need to be able to buy and sell stocks without having to disclose it. Remember, staffers are incredibly important to the legislative process. They're the ones who advise these lawmakers on the legislation, what they should support, what they shouldn't support. Their stock market activity is incredibly important. And of course, you now have this loosening of the regulations, the Stock Act in 2013, which essentially provides an opening for these staffers to buy and share or buy and sell stocks without having to disclose it, right? And all they needed to do was cite national security for the reason for doing that, or as the reason for doing that. Now, remember, the Stock Act basically just forces members of Congress to disclose what their stock activity is. And it doesn't ban them from making any questionable trades. So some in the financial industry have just decided to take advantage of how screwed up our system really is. At least one financial services consultant, who has a name I cannot pronounce, is planning to set up tracks congressional stock picks because, in his view, lawmakers are, quote, probably privy to more information than just the general public. And guess what? He is absolutely right about that. In fact, there have been studies looking at the performance of the stock portfolios that members of Congress have compared to or relative to the stock market in general. In fact, here's a CNBC explainer on that.
In March 2020, news spread that 4 U.S. senators, including Burr, were being investigated for insider trading.
Ahead of the drastic escalations in this pandemic, while still reassuring citizens that the U.S. was prepared.
Senator Burr vehemently denies the allegations against him, but here's what we know. On January 24th, the Senate's Health Committee held a briefing with CDC Director Robert Redfield and White House Pandemic Advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci, according to the Washington Post. About 2 weeks later, Burr and Tennessee Senator Lamar Alexander wrote a Fox News editorial that the U.S. was better prepared than ever to deal with a pandemic like the coronavirus. Less than a week later, the Dow set an all-time record, hitting just over 29,551 points. On February 13th, Burr sold between $630,000 and $1.7 million worth of investments. He did it in 33 separate transactions, and he didn't buy a single share.
So that's a very specific example of really bad behavior in Congress, but specifically bad behavior that helped these members of Congress to enrich themselves. They had access to classified information at the time. They had this closed door briefing, and immediately after that briefing was over, various members of the Senate decided to sell stocks that would be harmed by the pandemic while buying certain stocks that would do well during the pandemic, things like Zoom, for instance, things that would require working from home. So that's, again, a specific example. But this has been going on for a long, long time. The study Abnormal Returns from the Common Stock Investments of Members of the U.S. House of Representatives found that House members earn statistically significant positive abnormal returns, outperforming the market by 6 percentage points. In fact, senators tend to do even better, the authors say, citing their own earlier research from 2004. Senate portfolios show some of the highest excess returns ever recorded over a long period of time, significantly outperforming even hedge fund managers, with gains that are both economically large and statistically significant. Because, of course, again, not only do they have access to information that we as Americans do not have access to, they also get to make decisions on legislation. And when you're talking about congressional leadership, they get to make decisions on whether or not legislation is even considered. To give you more, now consider lawmakers like Joe Manchin, who personally profit off of the fossil fuel industry. Remember, the budget reconciliation bill is supposed to be the most robust attempt to respond to the climate emergency. But Joe Manchin doesn't want to respond to the climate emergency because that would mean harming himself financially. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, Manchin just last year alone made $500 million or nearly $500 million off of the coal industry through a company called Systems, a company he founded and then passed over to his son, but he's clearly still invested in. According to his most recent financial disclosure, Manchin gained $492,000 last year, to be exact, due to his non-public shares in a coal company called Systems, which records show is a contractor for a power plant in the state's north that burns waste coal. Meanwhile, Manchin's 2020 income for being a senator was $174,000. $174,000 is quite a bit of money, but obviously that's far less than the money that he's making from the coal industry. And there was a great piece just this week, I believe, by the Washington Post that looked into the number of jobs in West Virginia related to the coal industry. Because what we hear over and over and over again from Manchin is that his opposition to the reconciliation bill and the climate provisions included in it is that it's going to harm his own constituents. He's worried about losing jobs in his state. But the fact of the matter is, through this reporting, that only 3% of jobs in West Virginia are related to the coal industry. And the people of West Virginia are unfortunately now forced to pay far more in their energy bills because as the rest of the country is moving away from coal, they've decided, or the lawmakers in that state have decided to double down on coal. And that has led to an uptick in prices, which definitely enriches and benefits Joe Manchin and only harms the constituents in his state. Now, Biden hasn't made climate-related concessions to Manchin just yet, which I find a little funny because the whole point of making all the concessions that I mentioned earlier in this segment was to get Manchin on board to the reconciliation bill. Those were concessions that Manchin is unmoved by. What he would be moved by is doing away with the climate-related provisions because those are the very provisions that hurt his bottom line. But it's not just Congress that we should be concerned about because this is a system that has been set up to benefit elites in all parts of our government, including the judicial branch. So let's talk about that a little bit. District judges are supposed to hand down rulings based on the law and based on our Constitution and our constitutional rights, which is why it's a problem that literally dozens of them failed to recuse themselves in cases involving companies and corporations that they're personally invested in. And to be sure, they're allowed to be personally invested in it. And that's part of the problem. Now, the Wall Street Journal, of all places, found that judges have improperly failed to disqualify themselves from 685 court cases around the nation since 2010. The jurists were appointed by nearly every president, from Lyndon Johnson to Donald Trump. About 2/3 of federal district judges disclosed holdings of individual stocks, and nearly 1 of every 5 who did heard at least one case involving those companies, okay, or those stocks. Now, unsurprisingly, what happens if they're handing down rulings regarding companies that they're personally invested in? Well, let's give you the results. When judges participated in such cases, about 2/3 of their rulings on motions that were contested came down, oh, wow, look at that, in favor of their or their family's financial interests. Alerted to the violations, 56 of the judges have directed court clerks to notify parties in 329 lawsuits that they should have recused themselves. And by the way, that is what the law entails. They must recuse themselves. They failed to do so. That means new judges might be assigned potentially upending rulings. Think about what a waste of resources, what a waste of time that was. That these judges, A, have the ability to be invested in individual stocks and then fail to recuse themselves. And later on, I'll explain to you how this is not new. This has been going on for decades. Again, nothing bars judges from owning stocks, but federal law since 1974 has prohibited judges from hearing cases that involve a party in which they, their spouses, or their minor children have a legal or equitable interest, however small. And what's incredible is just how many of these judges who are supposed to have an understanding of the law, remember, they're making rulings based on the law, purport to not really know what the law is in regard to their own personal investments. The journal identified 36 conflicts by one judge in Colorado, R. Brooke Jackson. The cases included Apple, Chevron, Eli Lilly, Facebook, General Electric, Home Depot, Honeywell, International, Johnson & Johnson, JP Morgan, Pfizer, and Wells Fargo. I mean, this judge is getting down, getting busy, right? Now, reached by phone, this is amazing. Judge Jackson said he had no idea which stocks he owns because a money manager handles them and because his wife fills out his disclosure forms. He said that because he doesn't know, he couldn't have a conflict of interest. Told he was required to know under the law, he said, "That's news to me." Really? You're a judge. How do you not know what the law is, especially when it's a law pertaining to you and what you can and can't do as a judge? And by the way, this has been going on for quite some time. Through my research, I found this headline from the New York Times in 1999. Judges ruled on firms in their portfolios. In 2014, the Center for Public Integrity found that 59% of all federal appellate judges reported owning stock despite the risk that the companies in which they have a financial stake could come before them. By comparison, the prohibition of American families who directly own stock is much lower, just 15%. I'm sorry, the proportion, not prohibition, my bad. By comparison, the proportion of American families who directly own stock is much lower, just 15% as of 2010. And then, of course, there's another example from 2016, following a Washington Post investigation in 2006, not 2016. In 2006, the courts even added a computerized screening process to help judges avoid such conflicts, yet the problems continue. And it's no surprise that this is a system that enriches the elites and continues to make the rich richer. When you take a step back and you take a broader view of the stock market and who happens to be invested in it, it's not the majority of Americans. It's not ordinary Americans. It tends to be the wealthiest Americans. In fact, the wealthiest 10% of Americans now own 89% of all U.S. stocks, which is a record high that highlights the stock market's role in increasing wealth inequality. So look, the point that I'm trying to make is the very people who we elect, the very people we turn to for justice, happen to be the people who have this massive conflict of interest. They are personally enriched by the very market forces, right? The market activity and behavior that puts us at a disadvantage. And so when you hear the media's coverage of the ongoing negotiations of the budget reconciliation bill, push back against this idea that you have all these different parties negotiating on good faith. If they have these personal investments, if we have this system of legalized bribery, those are systemic issues that, again, have much more sway over their behavior, over how they govern the country than we do as unorganized Americans. And I say unorganized because really this is a commentary about power dynamics, right? A very tiny percentage of this country is unionized, right? About 6% of workers are unionized. We don't really have much power because of how atomized we are. At the same time, all of the incentives for these lawmakers, for these judges, for these very people in positions of power is in the wrong place. It benefits them, but puts us at a disadvantage. We need to understand the market forces, the way the system is set up, to do a real analysis and also have sound predictions of what happens in regard to legislation that, yes, at first seemed incredibly robust, but now is on the chopping block as all of these incredibly popular provisions get cut out. We are the only industrialized country, the only developed country that doesn't offer common sense social safety net programs for its people. I'm talking about healthcare. I'm talking about paid family leave. There's a reason for this. It isn't because we're uniquely bad people. It's because we have a system set up to ensure that corporations continue to make record profits, continue to hoard the wealth, continue to pay dividends to their shareholders. Everything revolves around that. And unless we change that power structure, unless we change the way the system works, we're not going to be able to get legislation that we so desperately need. Kale.
Let me fix that. There we go. Yeah. I mean, but Anna, isn't it just in the national interest for these people to have all this information? I mean, come on. Shouldn't they know these things and then also have the personal freedom that the same national interest that gives us freedom and democracy and all these rights? Shouldn't they also then have the freedom to then use that information? I mean, what's wrong with, like, these are just some pretty basic principles about America, right?
I mean, it's interesting. Like yesterday, Elizabeth Warren had a tweet about how ridiculous it is that federal officials can be invested in individual stocks. And, you know, I responded to it and said, I totally agree. So what's going to be done about it? And I was being a little facetious because obviously I know nothing's going to be done about it, right? Like it's a bit of an issue because the very people who are benefiting from this system aren't going to want to change the system. And so really, we can't like just turn to electoral politics to solve it. I think that it actually takes a lot more work than that. And it takes the organizing on the ground by people who want to force a change to that system. But yeah, I mean, like the conflict of interest is so clear and it's so brazen and it gets so little coverage in our media.
Right. Well, and it's just also that there are structures and institutions that are going to replicate themselves over time. That's why they are, in fact, structural or institutional and not just like ephemeral. You know, it's not just like someone's opinion this week that, oh, I think I'm going to invest in stocks because I think it's a good idea. It's because there's actually institutional and structural benefits to these things and punishments when people try to change that. So the fact that, you know, Elizabeth Warren might genuinely, truly want to change the system. She truly finds it amoral or wrong or, you know, against certain democratic principles or something. And that's fine. That's good. I'm glad that she feels that way. But like she, in her position in the Democratic Party, both as a single senator, but also just kind of in how the institutions of the Democratic Party work. I mean, she's not going to be able to transform that. This is like, this is what I'm about to get to in a second. It's funny because my segment kind of just bleeds so perfectly out of what you've just said. But just before that, I mean, this is essentially why working people and the poor historically have said, oh yeah, no, the rich are not just going to like change the system that's to their benefit. They're not going to willingly do that. Because even if they are morally good individuals, there's going to be incentives and punishments against doing that change that are going to override their best intentions and morals.
Exactly. I mean, Nando says it all the time, and he's absolutely correct. It doesn't matter what's in lawmakers' hearts.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter if they're good people or I mean, it does matter a little if they're like genuinely bad people. But it's about, yeah, the incentives and disincentives. Absolutely. And so oftentimes he talks about it in the context of like progressive lawmakers not doing enough or progressive lawmakers kind of turning on their constituents. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, all of the incentives work against us. You know what I'm saying? So the question is, how do you change that power dynamic?
Right.
You know, so there's actual punishment that can be handed down by the people as opposed to those in positions of power or the elite.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.